So recently we had Prime Minister David Cameron appear in front of the House of Commons, and he gave his case essentially for extending the military operations to Syria. And there are a number of legal issues that arise from that intervention, that statement, issues that might become relevant when MPs vote next week, potentially.
Yeah, that's right. So the issue is whether we should extend actions against ISIS or ISIL in Iraq into Syrian territory. And there, as you say, there are a number of issues in international law, and there are a number of domestic constitutional questions which we are concerned about. But what I think we should maybe try and iron out first is, as a matter of international law, is the use of force in the Syrian territory legal?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because Cameron, I mean, I'm looking at his report, it's 36 pages long, and on page 15 he says that the UN Security Council Resolution 2249, passed 20th of November 2015, gives the legal basis for military action against ISIL in Syria, and that it's a clear and unanimous determination by the Security Council that a threat to international peace and security exists, and that states have been called upon to take all measures necessary to prevent and suppress terrorist acts committed by ISIL. The problem with that reading of the resolution, and he talked about this yesterday in the House, he said that is a sufficient legal basis. The problem with that interpretation is that the resolution actually wasn't adopted under Chapter 7 measures of the United Nations Charter.
Okay.
So we can either have use of force authorized under Chapter 7,
Right.
or a country uses force in self-defense.
Right, okay.
And so what Cameron is saying is that Resolution 2249 gives a sufficient basis for that intervention. But the resolution, as I said, wasn't accepted under Chapter 7, even though it uses the language of Chapter 7. It talks about the threat to international peace, and it talks about sort of the code phrasing that we always use when the Security Council tries to say use of force is authorized. It says all necessary measures. But it doesn't use the word authorize or decide. So those are the important words the Security Council usually uses when authorizing use of force. So the problem currently in terms of thinking about international legality is that Security Council in a way has given countries a way out. They can say they've got the political support for action, but they don't actually have a legal basis for action. And so some of the commentators have said that there's creative ambiguity in the resolution, in the sense that it doesn't legally endorse military action, but gives the support of the Council for action to be taken. So it's a bit tricky to rely on this resolution to say that it gives you the basis to intervene in Syria.
So it sounds like to me then, if the international law position is not sufficiently clear, it sounds like what happens on a domestic level vis-a-vis the question of Syrian intervention is really, really important. So what kind of implication does Cameron's statement to the House of Commons have for the engagement of Parliament on the war question?
So domestically, we don't really discuss the issue of legality. There's no court that will decide whether or not the intervention in Syria would be legal. So it's a completely political decision, and it's a decision that that is one for the government to take. Or recently, government has involved Parliament in that equation. So Parliament has been asked to provide support in relation to Libyan intervention. It has famously been asked to provide support in 2013 for intervention in Syria, and then it declined to provide that support following a revolt from the backbenchers. Now, what's really interesting is, as I'm sure you've seen, when on Thursday Cameron talked about whether or not he would turn to the House to put the motion to a vote, he said that he would only do that if he had a sufficient majority of support for the action. So that has interesting implications.
Absolutely, because there's been some debate among academic lawyers about the emergence of a Consultation Convention as a matter of domestic constitutional practice, which grew out of the idea of there being approval sought for action in Iraq in 2003 on a substantive motion, and then the unsuccessful seeking of approval on the question of intervention in Syria in August 2013. So where are we now with the state of this convention?
Yeah, and that's why the statement is especially interesting. So Cameron's statement suggests that Parliament is only involved, is only engaged or only consulted if the outcome is positive. But that almost conditions the involvement of Parliament on a positive, on a supportive vote. So that sort of expects, he seems to be suggesting that Parliament should be used strategically.
Yeah. So it's not really a democratization of the war power prerogative. It sounds more like it's Cameron's asking for legitimization.
Yeah, there seems to be an expectation that Parliament will automatically, because this is a question of war, rally behind the Crown, so that it will accept the decision that has already been taken by the government, that it will, regardless of the information it has access to, or regardless of the international commitments, or any concerns it might have, and genuine concerns about the extent of the action or risk to domestic troops, that it will back effectively for the sake of bipartisanship and unity of the country, or giving that impression, that it will back the government's position.
Okay, so we're not sure at the moment whether or not a vote's going to take place next week, because there seems to be the factors that you described in play. If a vote is to take place next week, what should Parliament's role be? What should Parliament do, ideally?
So Parliament needs to or members of Parliament should, because of this emerging consultation convention, what kind of role MPs decide to play might be really important.
Okay.
Because if they just automatically rally behind the Crown, then it's almost like they're renouncing their own responsibility to participate in the decision of whether or not countries should go to war, should use force. So there are a couple of things that MPs should take into account, and I think they have been, when we look at the responses to the statement, they have been very engaging in that context. I think one element is, of course, the querying of the international legal basis. Is there an international legal basis? What is the government relying on? And are the conditions that international lawyers would expect to be fulfilled actually in place for that to be sort of ticked off? So that's the international legal question. But in addition to that, there must be a domestic political discussion of the concerns that are particularly British.
Okay.
So, for example, what is the risk to British troops? What are the economic and budgetary implications of, well, initial action, but also a prolonged action or intervention in Syria? Is there a potential for boots on the ground? And in the end, also, what is the British interest? Why does the government think it needs to intervene? Are there really those sort of elements present?
Okay, and do we think Parliament has enough information to do that at the moment?
Well, that is the question, right?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
Okay, yeah. I mean, part of the problem, I think, is that when we look back to Iraq, the real issue was the extent of the information which Parliament was provided. And obviously, legal advice wasn't disclosed, which is a matter of convention, and we can see that legal advice hasn't been disclosed in the most recent debate on Thursday. And there's also a number of factors in play as to how Parliament gets information. For example, routinely as a matter of constitutional practice, government ministers will not answer questions on the floor of the House relating to intelligence and national security. That's a prerogative they can exercise to not answer questions which are in the public interest. And this was a problem in the wake of Iraq 2003. And there was a series of reports by the Public Administration Select Committee that noted that there was a serious problem with ministers refusing to answer questions which related to the ongoing policies in Iraq.
Yeah.
Another problem is the way that intelligence is shared between members of the government and leaders of the opposition. It wasn't the case that no information was given to non-government parliamentarians in the case of Iraq, or in the case of Syria 2013, or even in the case of the debate that took place on Thursday last week. What happened, and this is a little known feature of the British Constitution, is that leaders of the opposition and government ministers are members of a historic institution called the Privy Council, which is a council established to assist the monarchy, and they take an oath of allegiance and confidentiality to the Privy Council, and that allows the government to share certain sensitive information with leaders of the opposition. For example, the so-called dodgy dossier was shared with leaders of the opposition in the run-up to the Iraq conflict in 2003. There was intelligence about Assad regime in Syria shared before the August 2013 debate, and there was the suggestion in the Hansard reports this morning that intelligence was also shared on Privy Council terms prior to Prime Minister Cameron's statement to the House, and that has the following consequences. The information that the opposition leaders receive cannot be commented upon on the floor of the House. It also cannot be shared with members of their party or parliamentarians. And that gives rise to the criticism in some circles that this technique of information sharing is used to close down debate or to preemptively secure the support of opposition leaders who will then go on to whip their party into voting on a motion in a certain way.
Yeah. How do we deal with, so a lot of the papers after the statement are reporting that there are elements of Cameron's case that are problematic just in terms of what is feasible on the ground and or what intelligence the country has access to. How do we avoid the situation in Iraq where Parliament was misled and when information was provided that was incorrect?
Well, that's actually a very, very difficult thing to do. I mean, prior to the most recent debate, we had a report about the case for war from the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which was quite sceptical. This was, of course, prior to the terrorist attacks in Paris. And it wasn't immediately clear on the face of that report how much information the Foreign Affairs Select Committee had access to. There is a general rule of the ministerial code that ministers shall not knowingly mislead Parliament in the answers to their questions. But the scope of enforcement of that rule is very much in doubt. For example, Sir Robin Butler said in his evidence to the Treasury and Civil Select Committee in 1994 in the wake of the Scott inquiry into the collapse of the Matrix Churchill trial on arms to Iraq that, quote, lying and misleading is always unequivocally wrong, but there are very rare occasions when a greater wrong is done by not lying than by lying. And also, if a minister or a member of the House is accused of lying to Parliament, ultimately the executive is a judge in its own cause on whether or not to dismiss the minister. So although we're seeing increasing parliamentary engagement, at the end of the day, we're still in a situation where on a question even as fundamental as initiating armed conflict with a foreign country or foreign organisation, the executive still holds the balance of power.
So what is then the role for the opposition? We see in the papers, just after the statement, they all mention the problems in the Labour Party. So talking about Labour being at war over airstrikes in Syria, both the Guardian, Independent and the Times talk about that. What are the Labour MPs to do? Follow Corbyn's?
Well, I think that's a really difficult question that goes to a matter of parliamentary practice. Normally, when issues are voted on in the House, for example, legislation, there will be a party line and members of that party will be expected to vote with their party on the policy of the party. And that's the role of the member of the party who's an MP, known as the whip, is to kind of go around and make sure that members of the party are going to do as they're told. And the severity of the whip can vary. The most severe type of whip is a 3-line whip, whereby if members rebel and don't vote against the policy of the and don't vote with the policy of the party, then there's a chance that they could face internal party discipline, and their career chances within the party could be damaged. So that's quite a severe policy to impose on members. There's a suggestion, as the newspapers make this morning, that the Labour Party is very, very divided, and of course Cameron is not sure if he can secure the support of the House, and that's in turn affecting his decision whether or not to hold a vote. I think, though, there are certain areas, subject matter areas, where the whip doesn't apply, and these tend to be considered as matters of conscience. For example, the very famous example discussed by Jeremy Waldron at length is the Abortion Act, and he cites that as an example of a very principled parliamentary debate on a matter of conscience, and as one of the better pieces of parliamentary decision making. And I think perhaps the issue of going to war, if we want the emerging Consultation Convention to really matter, should be one that is an issue of confidence, an issue of conscience, where each MP can consider the moral case for war, as David Cameron put it, according to his or her own values. And if we want the Consultation Convention to be meaningful, I would suggest that should be an essential feature of it.
Okay, so our conclusions then, if the vote were to take place next week, we think that both the substance of what is being discussed, so the international legality, the domestic concerns, and also the stance that the Parliament takes on the issue, that it feels engaged, that it recognises its own responsibility in being engaged on the issue, that it's not only a rubber stamp of a decision already taken.
Absolutely, this is about the dignity and the representative and constitutional politics.
Yeah.
And I don't think anything is really served by way of constitutional progress, however one defines that, to have a consultation convention that amounts to a rubber stamp on a fait accompli.
Good. Thank you.